Hello everybody, I'm Pastor Steve Green. This is Tuesday, May 19th, and it's refresh number 1 of our first message under the theme, Boundaries, a Key to Godly and Healthy Relationships. On Sunday, we told the story, many of you are familiar with it, of the Good Samaritan, and Jesus was the one who told this story to begin with, and he told of a certain man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was overtaken by thieves, and he was beaten and wounded and left for dead, and a priest walked by and ignored him, and a Levite walked by and ignored him, and then a Samaritan came by. Samaritans were not accepted by the Jews or thought highly of by the Jews. And this Samaritan, though, took care of the man and bound his wounds and put him on his own animal and took him to an inn and paid the innkeeper to look after him and stayed with him overnight and then promised the innkeeper that if the expenses were beyond what he had paid, then he would come back later and repay the innkeeper for all those expenses. And then we embellished the story. We added things, of course, that are not in the Bible, just in order to make a point. And we're not pretending our embellishment is the truth. We're just using the story to illustrate a point. And in our embellishment, the Good Samaritan was then going to leave the wounded man in the care of the innkeeper, but the wounded man begged him and pleaded with him to stay because he couldn't bear to be left alone, and he needed the emotional support of having a loving, caring person like the Good Samaritan with him, and in fact needed that to survive and get through this, what remained of this ordeal, and so he pleaded with the Good Samaritan to stay with him longer, and the Good Samaritan explained to him how he couldn't do that because he had important meetings planned and a big deal to sign with business associates in Jericho. And but then the wounded man just begged him all the more, and so the Good Samaritan relented and stayed with him a couple more days. And then after a couple days, a messenger came with a message for the Good Samaritan from his business associates, telling him that they had waited and waited and he hadn't showed up, and so they ended up signing the big business deal with one of his competitors. And when the Good Samaritan heard this, he turned angrily upon the wounded man and said if it wasn't for him, he would have been able to secure that deal for himself and his own company and for his own employees. And that was the story that we told. And so all of that was just to lead up to some questions. And so we asked these questions. And on Sunday, I don't believe we gave answers, although everybody obviously was free to come to their own conclusion what the answers were. Let's look at those questions again. The first one was, had the Samaritan left on the following day as he first intended, would he have done enough to help the wounded man? And I can't help but think the answer would have been yes. Otherwise, when Jesus told the story, he wouldn't have implied that what the Good Samaritan had done was good. He was using the story as an example of how to love your neighbor. And so it is possible, and here's the point, is that it's possible for us in our relationships to care for one another, to love one another, to do good for one another, and then come to a point where in a particular circumstance we have done enough for that circumstance. The next question was, do people lean too heavily on others at times in order to try to straighten out their own lives? And I think from my experience, from your experience, that does happen sometimes. When people are not leaning upon the Lord, then that is very much a possibility that people would try to derive their getting their needs met from squeezing it out of other people. Do the people being leaned on sometimes feel guilty for not having done enough in such circumstances? And again, I think we could all say from our own experience that sometimes people may feel guilty not because they haven't done enough. Maybe they've done enough and more, but simply because that pressure is being put on them. And then the final question was, once the Samaritan agreed to stay longer, in our revised version of the story, whose fault was it that he lost the business deal? According to our revised story, he got angry at the wounded man for making him stay. But in that case, that was his decision. It wasn't right for the wounded man to try to force and to use whatever manipulative techniques, perhaps guilt, to make the Samaritan stay. But it's also true that once the Samaritan chose to stay, that was his decision, and then it wasn't right for him to turn on the wounded man and blame him for what had been his decision. We're talking about boundaries and learning how our relationships operate within certain boundaries. This is a key to forming healthy relationships, godly and healthy relationships. We'll see you next time.